Good afternoon and welcome to the American Institutes for Research, or AIR's Equity Initiative Roundtable Series, Building Bridges to Equity, Data-Informed Approaches to Cultivate Peaceful Communities. My name is Dr. Shakira Munden. I am the Senior Program Officer with the AIR Equity Initiative and your host for today's webinar. First, let me extend my thank you to the audience for joining this powerful conversation among forward-thinking leaders from across the public safety and policing sectors. And thank you to our moderator and panelists in advance for leading this relevant discussion. Today for panel one, we're going to focus on diversity, dignity, and data in public safety systems. As part one of this two-part Justice Roundtable, we will look at fostering a deeper understanding of the possibilities for cultivating peaceful communities. Today's panelists represent diverse perspectives and will discuss the role of data and dignity in the current state of public safety systems and envision a data-informed public safety approaches that are more equitably respond to the needs of every community. But please make no mistake, advancing equity is not a new undertaking for AIR. The AIR mission for 75 years has been building and using evidence to improve lives. And in continuing a generational commitment to our mission, in 2021, AIR launched the Equity Initiative, a 5-year, $100 million plus investment in behavioral and social science research, technical assistance, and stakeholder partnerships. The AIR Equity Initiative is investing in the generation and use of high quality evidence that address the harmful effects of segregation by race and place. And this is an important part of our journey here together, as we've all bear witness to or experienced at the local, state, and national levels. Our nation is grappling with the consequences of systemic inequity. We believe at AIR Equity Initiative in rigorous evidence and technical assistance will enable us to make powerful changes. The Equity Initiative supports research in and collaboration with communities and others that are tackling the issues at the core of our national conversation on racial equity. That includes the sectors of education, workforce development, public safety and policing, and health. The AIR Equity Initiative is bold, transformative, and urgent. We are funding work to inform policies that are integral to questions of equity in America. Our grantees and staff will work alongside communities and other partners to generate and apply evidence that benefits and represents diverse, inclusive perspectives. It will support efforts to look at what works and what doesn't, and provide direction on what's needed to address long-standing systemic inequities. We are galvanized by this challenge and inspired by the determination of our partners to create long-lasting community-rooted change. And it is clear that the AIR Equity Initiative difference is that we offer more than an invitation, but a permanent, empowering seat to equity-seeking communities towards influencing the decisions and strategies and narratives impacting their lived experiences. So in respect to the public safety and policing sectors, the AIR Equity's multifaceted approach through research and funding, with emphasis of looking at data, strategic partnerships, and programming, is our meaningful pathway in achieving our mission. Our efforts in this space leverage AIR's expertise in both research and technical assistance, intentionally bridging the gap between research evidence and practice. Our 3 focus areas within the justice-related funding include data gathering and evaluation with an emphasis on accurate, inclusive, and sometimes overlooked data. strategic partnerships and consultancies with community and industry leaders to diversify voices and ideas, and examining the efficacy of community-level programming that integrates social historical experiences to rethink traditional policing strategies. The intention behind these investments is to really help shape solutions that reflect and respect the lived experiences of individuals in every community, including marginalized and underserved groups. AIR is both funding these grants and providing the research and technical assistance around the implementation. So prior to today's webinar, we asked the panel and you, the audience members, one question: to describe your vision of a peaceful community and what it is. And while visions of peaceful, thriving communities vary, I'll just take a brief moment to share mine. In shaping the new vision of justice in public safety and policing, it begins with recognizing the historic and contemporary effects of segregation and racism. Simply put, acknowledging our lived truths and experiences. It also involves empowering communities to co-create systemic solutions. And above all, validating and extolling the dignity of each individual. And speaking of those that are really truly dedicated to such a vision, I am proud to introduce today's wonderful moderator for the webinar. Our moderator for today is Nicholas Sensley, founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for American Police Reform. Nicholas Sensley is a former California police chief with over 22 years veteran consultant and developer at the Institute for American Police Reform. The Institute for American Police Reform is a nonpartisan agency providing guidance on policing laws and policies, leadership coaching, organization consulting, standards, and training development to state and local governments and the policing services they authorize and oversee. Nicholas has served as an instructor of leadership for the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims and Crime National Victim Assistance Academy, and volunteers as a team director for the Pointman Leadership Institute, a nonprofit institute focusing on ethics and anti-corruption in police forces and governments throughout the world. So without further ado, I will shift over today's webinar into the wonderful hands of Nicholas Sensley. Nicholas?
Thank you, Dr. Shakir, for that wonderful introduction. And good day and welcome to everyone. It is a true pleasure to have you join us in our discussion today. I'm very grateful to our host, the American Institutes for Research, in bringing us together in this roundtable discussion. We have a wonderful opportunity today to discuss the issues of data in the first of our two-part series as we look at building peaceful communities. So I'm going to jump right in, but I will begin by addressing the issue of data and information. We often hear in the world around us in common vernacular and in movies and throughout that information or data is power. What we prefer to think of in the context of our discussion today is that data or information leads to understanding. Understandings that allow us to recognize our strengths and our weaknesses and where we have need to improve upon ourselves, to improve upon our relationships, to broaden the collectiveness of being truly community. In many cases, the pathways to accomplishing peaceful communities is a journey of reformation. That journey begins with reattaching ourselves to what I like to think of as a refined definition of community. It is not as it relates to policing in community, a matter of the community and the police. It is an existence in which a community and its peace officers are defined within the context of community. It means equating public safety with equitable and fair treatment of all persons. Community wellness, it means community health. It means a collaborative engagement on all issues disruptive to peacefulness, things that are dangerous, threats to community wellness, acts of hate, of discrimination, of isolation, of marginalization, and of violence. It means that community-oriented policing is not a program, a project, or a theory of policing. It is, in fact, what defines policing. Currently, in the more prevailing norms of community, we still have a long way to go. We are not quite there yet. We do have a need to create a blueprint that leverages data and evidence that builds around a very multifaceted and inclusive and very equitable approaches to building community, existing within community, to leveraging the strengths of those who have capacity to lift up those who have diminished capacity through either social economic circumstances or other circumstances that invite inequitable treatment, particularly by those who have power and authority and control over others. When we look at policing, we have to realize and accept the impact of individuals with authority to remove freedoms and, in some cases, to take life. It's a very powerful responsibility. It's a very powerful breath of authority. American policing and policing generally throughout the world, these policing officials are often the most visible form of governance that the average citizen sees and experiences on a daily basis. So we often focus on the role of policing within communities when we're looking at how we measure the peacefulness of communities. And so as we go throughout our time today, we will have a strong focus on policing in communities. With that, I want to point out that from the American Institutes, from the Institute for American Police Reform, we have 5 pillars of police reform that we believe are the key to bridging gaps that have existed traditionally in policing and to bringing us back into a space of mutual regard for all persons throughout community and reducing the aspects of any forms of marginalization and isolation that leads to inequitable treatment. With that, we have with us a wonderful group of panelists that I would like to introduce to you. I'm going to begin with Ron Huberman. Ron Huberman is the CEO and the co-founder at Benchmark Analytics. During Ron's 16-year career with the Chicago city government, he helped tackle many of the challenges municipal government face in a variety of positions, including 9 years with the Chicago Police Department, advancing to assistant deputy superintendent, where Ron created the country's most advanced policing technology system and developed innovative community-based strategies that help decrease crime. So very happy to have Ron with us. Ron also served as the CEO and superintendent of Chicago's Public Schools, of Chicago Public Schools, where he initiated sweeping reforms, as well as serving as the executive director of Chicago's Office of Emergency Management and Communications, where he created the agency's state-of-the-art operations center. Next, we have Rashawn Ray. Rashawn Ray is an AIR Institute Fellow. He is also a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, Chicago Park. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequity, particularly focusing on police-civilian relationship and men's treatment of women. Dr. Ray advises and consults with the AIR Equity Initiative's work around justice and community police interaction. So we're very happy to have Dr. Ray with us as well. Also, we have with us Dr. Candace Hester. Dr. Hester is an AIR principal researcher, and I'm very happy to have her as a part of a team that working together with the Institute for American Police Reform. Candace Hester is a principal researcher at AIR and the project director and quantitative task leader on evaluation with the City of San Francisco's Department of Children, Youth, and their families to understand the implementation and the impact of justice system programs. Dr. Hester is simultaneously the principal investigator for a study to examine the implementation and outcomes of youth diversion programs in Oakland, California. Both studies use interviews with youth and adult stakeholders to understand implementation and administrative records and youth surveys to examine various outcomes and impact. So with that introduction of our panelists, I would like to move into our discussion. First, we want to really be on the same page of understanding what we mean when we focus on dignity. Really not losing sight of the importance of dignified uses of data, dignified methods of collecting data, the respect of persons to whom the impact that data will have. And so as we look at this issue of dignity and we recognize this just and righteous engagement of communities really begins with the rightful place of human dignity, I want to turn first to Ron. Ron, if you would for us, just take it to this place of understanding what we mean so that we're on a collective and same page around the issue of defining dignity. And why this is relevant for this conversation, especially as it relates to your lived experience from the field.
Yeah, I'm going to take it from the perspective of a street stop or a 911 call where this plays out every day. And I think about this in ways that dignity is defined in these interactions, these human interactions to me in kind of 5 fundamental ways that make them go right or make them go wrong. Really quickly, it starts with recognition of the individual. These are systems, and when the players in these systems don't recognize the individuality of people they're engaging with, dignity is lost. It's accountability. And what do I mean by accountability? It's that ultimately, if someone has been aggrieved or they have been wronged, there are no mechanisms for accountability. They're helpless and they lose dignity in that process. It's an honest accounting. It is a way to be able to be honest about what did or did not transpire that builds on human dignity. It's their ability to tell a story and have an audience for that story. If they can't share their experience, they lose dignity. And then finally, I would just say justice. And this one takes on many facets, but to the degree someone has been wronged and there's no justice to how they have been wronged, they lose dignity. And justice is more complicated because all too often The justice is not action, as we might imagine, action being an interaction between a police officer and a citizen, but it's lack of action. It's someone who has been the victim of a crime and there's indifference to their suffering and no justice. And I think that ultimately hurts us a lot. What I would say really quickly from the slide that you're seeing is that today we are in a better position as a society using information and data to solve some of these items of dignity I talked about, such as accountability and so forth. What we can tell you in 1 minute quickly here, and then I'm going to pass the baton, is that the work that we do at Benchmark in cooperation and collaboration with AIR and the University of Chicago and the Joyce Foundations, we study police data to help police be more effective and more accountable. What we know by studying that data is that ultimately we see that 5% of America's policing workforce is delivering the majority of injustice and indignities that are happening in our country. And how do we know that? Is because we see this 5% of the American workforce with a high degree of precision from a statistical perspective, delivering 66% of the injuries and disproportionate force events that happen on the streets. And I see that as an incredible opportunity to focus on those individuals who have the greatest opportunity to be a tipping point to things that are geared towards accountability and justice in the system. And the last quick point I'll make on that is that if we could say and wave a magic wand or understand this 5% of the American workforce, American policing workforce that is causing the majority of these issues, and we could equitably distribute them across American policing, it would be one thing. But I think what the data and the research shows is that 5% is concentrated in communities of color, making it even more profound and problematic. So within the same city, when we think of dignity, you may have one part of the city that ultimately has a great interaction with their police force and will look up and say, well, I think the police are fabulous. Another community within that same city might be experiencing a very different part of that police force because of the concentration of at-risk officers in low-income and minority communities. And it's that uneven distribution that is the most profound problem of how we think about this. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that in my perspective on where dignity is lost and the opportunity for us to focus on where we can make a difference.
Thank you, Ron. Very powerful statement in saying that if they can't share their experience, they lose their dignity. Certainly something to reflect on. I'm going to go to Candace. Candace, how is your work at AIR and in your AR Equity Initiative projects expanded pathways beyond quantitative to the qualitative in order to explore and promote dignity in this particular space?
Thank you, Nicholas. I am really grateful to be here today, and I'd love to build a little bit on what Ron shared and what you highlighted about sharing experiences and sharing power and having the opportunity to elevate voices more equitably so that the data can include those perspectives and allow us to make change and create feedback loops, which puts community stakeholders from, diverse populations within the community on equal footing with the police who are charged with serving their communities. I think that we have an undertaking with various equity initiative projects to look for opportunities to create more mechanisms for community stakeholders to feel like they are invited and included, to share their perspectives in a way that they will be heard and honored and not just used and stifled. And it's not easy, because a lot of what we know from the data currently is that there's a lack of trust. It's hard to bring people to the table to share their stories and their perspectives and make them feel like they will be honored and heard. We are just starting that work of trying to create strategies and feedback loops that will open up those doors. But I don't know, there's a lot to be done, I guess. There's a lot of history that we're working against, frankly. And there's a lot of ways in which the current data may not honestly display the perspectives of all individuals equitably. So the way that the reportings of various events are accounted for and perceived and presented may not equitably demonstrate all individuals' experiences. And some people are not interested in engaging in a system that's been turned against them repeatedly over and over again. So trying to come up with new strategies and systems and build trust and conversation and community is an upward battle, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to participate in that and to work with institutions like the Institute for American Policing Reform, like the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform based in Oakland, and like the San Francisco Department of Children, Youth, and Their Families, to think about various institutions that can serve more of a moderating role, to bring different community members and police members together to think more strategically about how to equitably elevate various voices, experiences, and stories. But I don't want to be overly simplistic about it because there's certainly a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Candace. You really bring about a significant point with regard to bringing communities together in a hope to have a sense of equal footing so that we can begin to build trust, break down the barriers, and elevate the role of the broader community ownership of policing. Policing isn't owned by the police as an institution. The police serve with the approbation of the people. Therefore, that permission must be constantly reinforced through trust. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Rashawn. Rashawn, and considering your work on engaging social change by embracing a diversity, police-civilian relationships, why is equity essential for a peaceful community? It seems like a self-evident question, but often it doesn't come across as such.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Nicholas. It's great to be here with you, Candace, and Ron, and ARR. Look, simply put, we can't have peaceful communities without equity. Simply does not exist without it. And it's important to distinguish between equity and equality. See, equity is giving people in communities what they need. Equality is giving people in communities the same thing. See, before we can actually get to equality, which is what all of us want, we actually have to deal with equity, because we know that inequitability has been something that's been a fundamental part of our nation since before its founding. And the way that these communities were created, police officers, at least today, did not create that. But unfortunately, they are oftentimes the culprits behind standing between dignity and equality and peace, at least the way that we think about it in a theoretical and holistic way, and some of the things that they see every single day on their jobs that they try not to bring home, that they try not to talk to their family members and friends about, and the ways that they try to keep us safe. And listening to Ron and talking about that small segment of what people will call bad apples, part of the reason why I always say that bad apples come from rotten trees is because oftentimes the system is set up to protect those bad apples. So those bad apples are part of a system that allows them to continue to proliferate. And as we heard, typically they might proliferate in neighborhoods that tend to be predominantly Black or predominantly Latino or lower income. So creating accountability is central for equity. Creating policies to deal with those bad apples is essential to equity. And part of what my research has shown at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research is creating what I call a GAP program, or good apple protections, is essential. See, converse to these bad apples, there are a lot of good apples, if we want to call it that, in policing. I would say an overwhelming number. But the way that the system and the structure is set up, they actually get stigmatized for speaking up and speaking out, for going against the blue wall of silence, which doesn't simply exist because they want to stay loyal. It also exists because there are consequences to doing something about it. So some of the things that we've aimed to do is think about how can we assist law enforcement in dealing with some of the equity issues. A few years ago, well, several years ago now, what we started doing was implicit bias training with police officers, started in the state of Maryland, then quickly expanded around the country, where our police training program was approved by the Maryland State Police Training Commission. Law enforcement came in for 2 full days to do a series of engaging exercises to help address implicit bias. Part of thinking about that as well is we work with the Department of Homeland Security, small, large, and medium-sized departments, which was really, really important for us. One of the big things that we found in the literature is that overwhelmingly, people will focus on these large departments, and they will miss the small and mid-sized departments where they don't have the resources, where they can't do things, where oftentimes they are required to engage in a series of wraparound services. We quickly realized that implicit bias trainings were really limited to individuals, and we needed to focus on this structure, on the organizational structure that was at play. So we created a virtual reality training program with computer scientists and engineers at the University of Maryland, later with Jigsaw Google, to take law enforcement through the sort of encounters they have every single day. As Ron was saying, a street encounter, encountering a suspicious person, or a domestic scene at a house, or a mental health response. And through that, we are able to give departments back a detailed demographic data output of how their officers are performing, and then also just some suggestions with the data on things that they might do to align with their own training.
There's a lot to break down in that, Rashawn. And so, I just want to take just a second to emphasize that I think we all collectively agree. And I will refer to sort of the tagline we use at the Institute for American Policing Reform, which I prefer to think of it as a value statement. That is, police are essential. So is reform. And we cannot understate the essential nature of the men and women and that role that they perform in a society being really key and essential to our society. These individuals who have families to go home to, these individuals who make a great sacrifice for society. When everyone else is running in one direction from harm, they're running toward harm. And I don't want it ever to be lost on any part of discussion or any level of understanding the value that we place on this role for individuals who step into that space. I'm going to stick with you, Rashawn, because I would really like to bring you back to defining data and its importance in this discussion. And I'd like you to touch on the relevance of data in the socio-historical narrative and impact of data, because you mentioned the history, which is very important for us to acknowledge for looking at where policing is today. Speak to this issue of data in that socio-historical context.
Yeah, well, Candace spoke to it a second ago about how, look, data has morphed over time, and who controls the data oftentimes controls what the results look like to the public. And I know that is something that I'll tell people working with law enforcement around the country is something that they want to change and really change the perception of that. So data are vital for objectivity and then current and future direction. One of the things I've learned about law enforcement, they are very data driven because they are very objectively minded in terms of how they approach things. That becomes important. What I've also realized is while law enforcement might be collecting a lot of data, they are not necessarily trained to code or analyze that data or even think about what to do afterwards. The other thing I've realized with data is that for too long in law enforcement, we have taken a deficit approach to data. By deficit approach, meaning people should just think about the top 3, you could even do 5, maybe even 10 outcomes linked to law enforcement. Just think about them for a second. They're all negative stuff. How many people they kill, how many people they arrest, how many, people they brutalize. It's all negative. And instead, what I realize is that the opposite of the deficit approach is never included. The things that they do every single day, where they help someone get wraparound services, where they have a conversation with someone who might be suicidal, where they talk someone down or they actually prevent a crime. We have a very deficit approach to data, which means, as we'll talk about in a little bit, I know there's another question about then, sort of how we think about that. But accordingly, I think what's important is we then assume that the absence of evidence is evidence. What do I mean by that? Well, when I talk to a lot of law enforcement, they get really freaked out about collecting data on race. And one thing I try to explain to them, I'm like, well, look, if you actually want to show that racism isn't happening here and that race isn't a factor, you don't do that by not collecting it. You actually do that by collecting data on race and a whole bunch of other stuff, and then performing a set of statistical analyses with rigorous methodological approaches to show that. And part of that then helps us to say, well, and this is the other thing about it, it's not even as simple as saying race or inequality exists. It's more about to what extent does it exist? It's more about the how. How does it exist? Different departments I've worked with, for some of them, it's been with traffic stops. For others, it's been with use of force. For other departments, it's been with language usage. Those are all fundamentally different concerns, right? Some that have a greater risk to people's bodily harm than others. But I say all that to say, I think when we talk about data, it's about showing law enforcement that there's a rigorous approach. And by doing so, I found that they typically are much more likely to get on board with how data can actually help them in their everyday lives.
Thank you for pointing that out. I mean, certainly when it really comes down to what we often see, we are heavily focusing in the media. We do tend to go to that which is sensationalized about the data, be the data accurate or not. It does also matter that we look holistically in order to bring about holistic change. Then in referring to your comments about this, Candace, I'm going to circle back to you then to take us a little bit further on understanding how data has been a help and maybe perhaps a hindrance in public safety. So if you could just discuss for us your work and AIR's work to help reduce harm associated with the use of data in public safety and increase the benefits of using data as we collect and gather.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of data available and there's a lot of data that's not available, as we talked about before. And I think one of the most powerful ways to use data is to bring different people together to talk about the kinds of data they're interested in and to think more broadly about the kinds of interventions or reforms that might be useful to bring to bear in the in use of those data. So we have more of a comparison, right? Like, what do things look like now? What happens as we unroll a reform? How can we give continuous improvement information to various people who are implementing those strategies and make sure that what's happening is happening in a way that they feel good about, and that the people whose opinions matter are as broadly conceived as possible. So not just how do, traditional whatever policymakers feel about the implementation of the intervention, but how do community members feel? How do youth feel? How do police feel? How do police, chiefs feel, but also how do everyday people who are on a beat feel? I think what we're learning more and more is that sometimes police don't even want to be involved in some of the contacts that they're asked to be involved with. So if we allow them an opportunity to share that feedback honestly, and we think more broadly about the kinds of ways that other different institutions within a community could be leveraged, that might create an opportunity where all people have, their voices elevated toward better solutions. And a lot of that work is what the Equity Initiative is about. So some of what is going on with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform is about thinking about how we leverage community-based programming to support interventions or to support encounters that may not need police. Maybe they're a result of mental health challenges or other sorts of trauma that could be better dealt with in other stakeholders' hands, but we're not allowing the opportunity for that to flow through those different mechanisms, and more importantly, to gather information about how that feels for folks when we explore those other intervention strategies. So I'm really excited about that. Some of the work we have in San Francisco right now is about going into different detention centers and talking to youth and asking them about their experiences. But going back to what we just talked about a little bit before, part of the issue, frankly, is trust. They want to know who's sending us there, who's going to hear that information, and how is that going to affect them down the line. So creating opportunities for people to share their experiences and to have trust that those experiences will be taken care of and shared back in a way that doesn't come back to burden or harm them is fundamental to coming up with solutions that work for multiple different people. And I think you would find the same thing, honestly, talking to different kinds of police officers. As Dr. Ray mentioned, how do we protect the good apples, right? Like, how do we come up with ways to share strategies and collect data on the implementation of those strategies in a way that honor the dignity of all the stakeholders?
Well, thank you, Candace. You again have really touched on a number of key issues, and in listening to the strong emphasis that you placed on the importance of the voices that are being heard. It really also goes back to Rashawn's point about how we look at the data and the categories that we tend to put the data into. And so in bringing together the various voices to hear things differently, particularly the police officers themselves across the spectrum in the hierarchy of policing. I'm going to take a moment just to emphasize that out of 25 years of active policing, my 25 years of active policing service, and over 2 decades of working with police across the United States and around the world, I don't know of a police officer or police chief, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, etc., who wouldn't be more than happy that if you're going to, for instance, take away funding from them, or as it is called, defund the police, if you are going to take away those services that have been piled on them year after year after year, because nowhere else within the society and community has there been an attempt to resolve those issues without bringing it to this group of 24/7, 365 public servants who are available. There's no one among that group who would argue, take those away. But the problem is there's often no funding attached to it. There's nothing to defund. There's only the services that have been piled on and on and on to this service group for decades. It's our perspective at the Institute for American Policing Reform that true reform has not occurred in American policing for a very long time, if at all. There's only been adjustments. The reform that has thus far been claimed has been by the police coming to society saying, okay, if you want reform, we will provide the reform, we will tell you what it's about. But what you're pointing out, Candace and Rashawn and Ron, is that there needs to be a new model of reform where there are different voices heard. There are different approaches to defining reform. So with that, I really want to circle back to Ron and Rashawn, and together just take us down the path of answering this next question, beginning with you, Ron. Can you just discuss for us what is meant by de-weaponization of data as it pertains to actionable outcomes in police officer development and in policing development, and the advances that we have in data collection and bias reduction? Because, we can, as was really alluded to, we can often use data in ways that's harmful to the actors and the agents in the space. So we need to come along to improve their response. So discuss that for us, starting with you, Ron, and then going back to Rashawn.
Yeah, look, I would think there's two things, right? Whenever we engage in data collection, we have to ask to what end? What is the goal of the data collection, right? Meaning if we have a home run and we collect the data and we analyze it, what do we hope we will be smarter about from that data? And when you ask that question, I would say two things become really clear, and Rashawn touched on one of them. One of the things that becomes clear is we collect today a certain amount of data, actually a ton of data, right? But we don't use it from a governance and policy perspective to improve things. And let me just give you a really quick real world example. We just finished work with TCOLE and Texas 2036. TCOLE is the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. They provide governance over Texas law enforcement. When we got into the data, we released, and it just got publicized, that 1,400 officers who were terminated for dishonorable service were rehired since 2012, 1,400. So now you think about this massive data collection machine on officer certification and all of this work. And what does it reveal? It reveals it doesn't mean anything, right? It is a false flag of accountability. Because if you can get fired in a profession that has as much power as a police officer, and you can get rehired, and it can happen 1,400 times in an 8-year window, that's wildly problematic. So the first question I would say on whatever terminology we use on weaponization, de-weaponization, is we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing with the data? And shame on the governance structures and others if we're not using that data today to be brutally honest with ourselves about what's happening and take action. The second thing it lends to, if we think about it as de-weaponization, is what is balanced data? All of the data is on the police, 100% of it, right? Meaning it is measuring police activities and behaviors in certain ways, right? And it is a massive void of understanding what makes for peaceful communities. There are so many other metrics and players who should be accountable in peaceful communities. And to your point, Nicholas, it all falls on the police today, right? Crime goes up, disorder occurs in communities, and we turn to the police. And the police, in turn, turn up what they do, right? Because they feel the heat for crime. And if we had a broader audience and participants in these problems, right, it would lead to new and innovative solutions that would de-emphasize the need for police to engage in the one thing they know how to do well, which is enforcement activity, right? That is the default from 100 years ago through the 1950s in the professional model of policing through today. And that's what really needs to change before we can think about who responds to 911 calls, right? We need to get to the underlying issue of the disorder and who are all the players that can impact that.
Yeah, I mean, ditto. Look, I mean, one of the things that Ron said that's so important is he's highlighting how bad apples proliferate. I mean, these officers who should not be allowed to be police officers are just being pushed around to different places. And I think we could obviously talk about that. I have a lot of thoughts on that as well. When we talk about the de-weaponization of data, the big thing is that police worry that they're going to go through some sort of research experiment, that they're going to be treated like lab rats, and that whatever information that they provide and data they provide, that they'll get vilified for it in court, that they'll lose their jobs, lose their pensions, lose their families. I mean, and again, this is me as a researcher who has interacted with thousands of police officers where I've heard this narrative a lot. So what do we do about that? How do we address this? Well, I give you one example and then what that looks like in practice. So a small to mid-sized department that we've worked with as an example, we always go in and try to ensure confidentiality, privacy, and transparency. Those things lead to trust. One of the big things we've learned is that as researchers, what we do is we collect data and we have the institutional review board. We do all these things to protect law enforcement. And well, not just law enforcement, but our participants and respondents in studies. All law enforcement sees is, oh, here's another document I'm going to sign that can be used against me. So one thing we've learned to do is to have verbal consent. We say, we've heard you. We want to protect you as much as possible. The way we do that is through verbal consent. So of course, we're going to still get your data, and we help them to understand the difference between confidentiality and the privacy of data. We're not going to use your name. We're not going to use your badge number. But we are going to collect this demographic information. And we are going to link it to, how you engage, how you behave, your attitudes. So I think that's part of it. The other two things that we've learned is that working with law enforcement is very, very local. I tend to think too localized. I mean, there are roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. I think that's a problem. The way that people move and migrate around the United States today, it used to be, sure, if you were in California compared to DC, rarely do people go to those places like that. Now you can do that within the same day and get back the next day. And all of a sudden you've had very different interactions with law enforcement. So that's a problem. The other thing we've learned is that the history in a particular area from different positionalities matters. Candace spoke to this about it's important to go in, talk to people, not only police officers and activists if they're, say, on the extremes, but just people who've lived there for 20, 30 years, who have grown up there to figure out what is the climate, what are the sort of things happening there? What does that look like in real time working with law enforcement to de-weaponize data? Well, it means providing examples of our work. What we do is we provide existing reports. We say, here's a report. We're going to anonymize it, make it confidential, of another department that we've worked with for you to be able to see that. In this regard, we've learned as researchers to reach across the aisle, help law enforcement, again, understand that in order to address race in your department, which is typically where I'm coming in, we have to collect it. Like there's no other way around it. That is a non-negotiable. But according to what we do with that report, we then hold a workshop with law enforcement that then helps them to ask whatever questions they want and walk through the data of how we collect it, how we code it, how we analyze it, and how we present it. Because again, we have to remember, what I've learned about law enforcement, they're collecting a lot of data. There's a lot of data being collected about them, but that doesn't mean that they fundamentally understand it. They definitely don't understand how to analyze it. That is not their job. Nicholas, to your point, that's another example of asking law enforcement to do something they aren't trained to do and just continuously throwing things at them that they're not trained to do, that they don't want to do, and that they're not good at. That is unfair, and we have to stop doing that. But in order for researchers to work with them, what we have to understand as researchers, we can't simply go in and have things just be anonymized and we don't tell them anything like it's some sort of secretive experiment. That's not going to work with law enforcement. They're savvy, they're smart. We have to go in and say, we are here to collaborate with you and we're going to come to a common ground before we start doing anything else, so that then the data can be used to help and not harm.
Excellent point. So then, still speaking on data and issues of harm, I'm really excited to go to question and answer. I'm seeing a number of good questions come in. And so I'm going to start with a question from one panelist. It says that, as most of us are aware, data is an important and highly valuable thing, especially in a digital age. I'm curious as to questioner, as to how much of the data can be trusted and to what extent. I would like to answer that question for us about the trustworthiness. I'm going to go to you, Candace, and have you take the first shot at that.
I'd be happy to. I was also interested in what the other panelists would say. I mean, I think I talked a little bit at the beginning that the way we all bring perspective and bias to bear whenever we're interfacing with data, whether we're the people who are collecting the data, the people who are, creating the data, like giving their own personal account, or the people who are interpreting the data. So I think that it's appropriate to bring into question whether the data can be trusted, particularly when they're disproportionately representative of certain perspectives. And sometimes people feel pushed into a corner, right? And it's perhaps understandable that their representation of the data would not be as kind of unbiased as one might want, but we can create different strategies for collecting different perspectives to try to make a more trustworthy system, I think.
All right, Ron, you want to follow up on
Yeah,
that?
I would just say all data is different. So I don't think we can paint any broad brush on data. So I would ask the question, what data? And there's two things about data integrity I think we should all think about. So one is we got to look at the data source, and more in the modern age of policing, data has more and more integrity. And it's just because everyone's got video. The police have video, the citizens have video. It has changed the narrative dramatically Certainly from when I was on the street, Nicholas, or you were on the street, I think it's a different game relative to integrity in terms of seeing what actually happened. The second thing I would say about data is what scares the police, right? And I think it scares the community too in different ways, is data in isolation. So the number one thing I hear from cops when we talk about the fact that we capture race-based data in force, they will say, well, I work in a community that is 95% African-American. My data will look biased. And without recognizing that context matters, then there's no trust, right? Context of data matters as important as the data itself. And I think the trust begins with folks being afraid of not the individual data elements, it's that the data is going to be taken out of context, that they will be labeled outside of the construct of the world that they live in and the reality of their jobs. And so those are things that I think we need to think about when we think about how we utilize and share and base decisions on data.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, I mean, Ron and Dr. Hester bring up some excellent points. Look, first, all data have strengths and limitations. We have to be upfront about those. I think that becomes important. However, we have to help people realize that the more data points we have, the more we can say. So part of thinking about sampling becomes extremely important. Now, with that said, I'm typically in the middle of both sides that distrust data. And when I say that, like even when this question came in, I'm like, is this a law enforcement person to distrust data, or is this a community person to distrust data? Because neither one of them trusts data. And it speaks to this issue. And I do think it's changed a lot. What we try to do at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we try to help them to trust our process with past results. We say, look, the proof is in the pudding with what we've done. And it's always interesting, particularly with law enforcement, they'll say, well, we haven't heard of laser. And I'm like, exactly, that's purposeful. But we've worked with dozens and dozens of police departments around the country. And that should let you know that we're not letting these sort of things get out, but we are doing a lot of work internally to try to help you address this particular issue. So, I mean, when it comes to data, we want to help people identify very specific things around sampling, around what questions we're asking, what measures we have, what sort of methodological analysis we're using, and as researchers to be able to say it in a simplified way. You know, the way I think about interacting with law enforcement, and of course, there are tons of, I mean, some of the most intelligent people I know are police officers, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have advanced degrees and have taken statistics and these sort of things, is always say, okay, if I make a statement and I know that my grandmother would say, yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, that means I'm about where I am. She's a very intelligent person, very wise, very experienced, obviously. And sometimes as researchers, we can talk over people's heads. That's not effective. That simply means people think we're smart. That doesn't mean that we reach to a place where we start to get to a place of trust. Because when we start to talk about data integrity and we start to think about whether or not the data is valid and reliable, oftentimes that comes back to trust. And you get people to trust the process, not necessarily you.
I also think for data, the ultimate challenge on some degree is we can all make data look different ways. And we can all apply all the statistical rigor we want, but no one trusts data that doesn't validate their life experience. So if someone has had a bad experience with the police and they have a narrative that goes back generations in their family of injustice with the police, there is no amount of data that will make them believe the police are accountable and doing a good job. Which is not going to happen, right? And vice versa. And so I think when it comes to police and it comes to communities, building on what Rashawn said, we have to capture the data and we have to analyze it. We have to do it rigorously, right? It's table stakes because we can't understand what's happening without it. But it has to be married with this earlier concept of dignity and giving people a voice, because otherwise no one's buying in, right? Policymakers might, and that matters. But ultimately, at the level of the street, it won't matter. Everyone's going to look for that one study that says what they believe. And so I think the challenge of the work that Candace, you laid out that you're doing, and Rashawn, the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing is ultimately finding ways to bridge that, right? So we need data to drive the policy, but on the streets, in the neighborhood, it's way beyond data and it's beyond statistics. It goes to the human interaction. And if we don't alter the human interaction, nothing else will ultimately change.
Excellent. Excellent. I think we've made some very strong points around data, its relevancy, and how do we use. I'm looking at a number of really wonderful questions that are flowing through from the participants in this. I'm going to step to a few that get close just to some of these practical issues. Kind of goes into what Ron just said. Well, no one can trust data that doesn't fit into their life experiences, right? That area isn't validated by their life experience. I think it's a very powerful statement. One question is that they've heard a great deal of body cam data has been collected, but very few were processed, reviewed, or shared. Does anyone have any insight about data that's collected, used, or not used as it relates to body cam? Maybe Candace, is there anything in your experience or in your work and in your projects where that's come up as a relevant concern?
We don't deal with body cam data at this point, unfortunately, but I think maybe one of the other panelists may.
Ron, anything in your experience around that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two macro trends from my perspective happening with all of the video, right? One is it is used primarily from the lens of the negative versus the lens of the positive. So no one reviews on scale body cam footage and says, wow, this officer is someone we need to elevate. They understand how policing should be done. So it's used in the negative. So please view it negatively, right? And it's concurrent with that. When I say used on the negative, it's also used to validate and be a proof point for crime, which is powerful because video is the most honest broker of an interaction. And I think that's positive. And the second thing I would say too is that ultimately there's so much video out there that not even 1% is evaluated or reviewed. And so it is this massive amount of data that, because police are overworked and they're chasing one 911 call to another, no one's stopping to look at and learn from. This idea of the football huddle, if you will, I think is very powerful, where people look collectively as a team and reflect on video that they can learn from in policing and in communities is a really big missed opportunity today of how we should be using body cam footage.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, oftentimes there is a very blunt reality. What you see on the camera is what it is. But oftentimes there are things in the background of it. But we saw certainly in the murder of George Floyd, what you saw on the camera was what you got in terms of that circumstances. So in this age of cameras everywhere, it's a very important element of analyzing and considering the issues of behavior, performance, and the things that disrupt peace within communities. In another question, I'm going to take this to Candace, simply because I know that she and I are looking at this in some of our mutual work. The question is, which community players are you thinking of to take the pressure off of law enforcement to cultivate peaceful communities?
Yeah, there's a number of organizations right now that are looking to leverage a wide variety of community supports that are existing, and to think of a more holistic perspective in the ways that we address any kind of misbehavior or trauma or mental needs. So that can be counselors, that can be educators, that can be workforce development programs. Those can be restorative practices practitioners that help to convene different perspectives to address a problem. It's about taking different sorts of people to bring to bear to talk through an issue, rather than having a more traditional punitive justice system strategy to address any kind of harm that's been done.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to fly through as many of these other questions as I can. So very quickly, Rashawn, coming to you, perhaps you can take this one for us. Can you share any example of metrics related to peaceful communities and public safety, as opposed to just looking at police data?
Metrics related to peaceful communities. Well, I would say one of the big shifts deals with mental health responses. What we're starting to see, I think it's a really good example, because not only does it lead to shared governance and taking some pressure and stress off of law enforcement. This is me thinking about Denver and their STAR program, where they're sending out They're sending out counselors with law enforcement to respond to these particular calls. So not only does that take pressure off law enforcement, they're also looking at some of the positive outcomes. They're looking at how many people were not arrested compared to just arrested. They're looking at how many people got wraparound services. What's the percentage where use of force was not used? So really taking a positive example. And I think that there are other departments around the country that are starting to use that same model.
I'm going to keep it with you, Rashawn, just as it relates to a point that you made earlier. A questioner asked, I got the difference between equity and equality. Are there any similarities between them? This question comes up.
Yeah, I mean, look, most definitely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's about trying to ensure that everyone gets a fair shake, right? But two fundamental ways that we need to think about it from a policy framework perspective. Equality is about procedural justice, ensuring that the process is the same for everyone. Equity is really about corrective justice, right? It's saying that there is something that happened in the past that we must acknowledge and address if we want to deal with it in the now. And I think in the United States, we have all been socialized about equality without realizing that we tend to get to a point and we say, oh, we know all these bad things have happened in the past. We're just going to act like that didn't happen. We're just going to do a reset and keep moving forward without addressing what's happening in these communities. And that's been one of the problems. And Nicholas, you said it earlier about law enforcement when you said, I mean, what has changed over time? Like, we have to be really, really clear about this. And we're not talking about necessarily how advanced the training is and those sorts of things. I mean, a lot of that has changed. And of course, we've seen the shift from the warrior to the guardian perspective, and we've seen more community policing approaches and the way technology is used. But part of what I'm getting at is from time period to time period, more or less the same officers have been there. We haven't seen fundamental shifts in what that looks like. And so when we start talking about equity and equality, of course, they're fundamentally related. But law enforcement, they're oftentimes put in communities where they say things are supposed to be equal. And like I think Ron was saying it earlier, officer that's in a neighborhood that's 95% Black compared to a neighborhood that's 5% Black, those are not the same type of communities. And acting as if that officers are just supposed to go in and treat them the same does a disservice to the officers trying to do that, and particularly does a disservice to the people in those particular communities.
Thank you.
Right.
And
Let me just
I was
add,
just going to build on Dr. Ray to say, and also the other supports in those communities are not the same, right? So like putting all that on the officer may be inappropriate.
I was just, Candace, it was going to be my point too, and very often looking at equity only in the lens of policing is really problematic. So like the one stat I always gave when I was superintendent of the Chicago public school system is I had at the time $6,800 per pupil per year to educate and support that child. The suburbs that touched Chicago on the north, for example, Evanston was spending $21,000 per child. So 3x for 16 years of that kid's life. Those kids in that suburb were getting 16x, we're getting 3 times the funding for 16 years straight. So this equity issue needs to be holistic in these communities, or we're going to miss it.
thank you. We're great deal of like-mindedness and understanding the issues at play. And I'm going to close before I turn it over to Dr. Shakira to close it out for us on one last question, that just how do we encourage law enforcement to adopt changes that may be contrary to its established training or ingrained perspective? I love this question, and I'm going to answer this question because it really does relate to the fundamental approach that the Institute for American Policing Reform is taking in addressing change. We are looking at the very culture of American policing. In other words, we want to look at what are those underlying basic assumptions that are made rather collectively, not necessarily consciously, about police that affect issues, for instance, of inequitable treatment, of racial bias, inappropriate profiling. There are those things which are basic underlying assumptions that have no attachment to law, that have no attachment to policy. Well, they just are. Quickly, by example, if someone says, well, if a Black youth goes to a primarily white and wealthy neighborhood, then I think that perhaps I ought to stop him to find out what he is doing, he or she is doing there. Then the question goes, well, why? What is the basic underlying assumption that exists that would allow you to draw that conclusion? There's no law, there's no policy. That individual has a right to walk through any neighborhood that they want to. What assumption are you making? So we have an approach, a collective approach of wanting to bring about change. That's going to be hard, but we know that it can be done because it's all about elevating policing in America. And we think that it's a heavy lift, but it's one that can be done. And with that, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, panelists, for your just excellent insights. Really looking forward to our second panelist, and hope everyone here today will invite your friends to come back to the next. And I'm going to turn it over with gratitude to Dr. Shakira to close it out for us.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas, and to our panelists. I think that for me, the quote unquote for today is, who controls data? Those gatekeepers controls what is put forth over time. However, the large takeaway that our wonderful panel and moderator really set into place is that the data must honor and be reflective of diversified experiences and provide equality and equity for all. So thank you to all of our phenomenal panelists and our moderator, Nicholas Sensley, for sharing your experiences and truths regarding public safety and policing with us. I know that we've only scratched the surface of this discussion, as you can see from the number of inquiries that continuously come forth. The audience very much so is engaged and wants to learn more about this particular topic. And thank you, of course, to the audience for joining us today and posing excellent inquiries. One example of your thoughtful questions was in reference to the course, The Community Players, which is such a perfect bridge to our next webinar. Today's engaging session is only the beginning of this relevant conversation that requires everyone's attention and contribution towards nullifying systemic inequities. On behalf of the AIR Equity Initiative and AIR, thank you for your time.